Right, this tutorial is to show you how you can work with image sequences in After Effects. I've already made a tutorial about working with image sequences and Photoshop. It's worth having a look at that because it shows you how you can prepare your image sequences ready to go into Photoshop, and exactly the same process applies to After Effects. So I'm going to start off by making a new composition. I can hit here, or I can go to Composition New, Command N if you want a Mac. I'm going to call this Demo, and I'm going to keep it at 1080p, 25 frames per second. Okay, so that's our composition. I'm now going to import an image sequence. Let me find one. Right, this is the one that we were working with earlier in Photoshop. Now notice exactly the same as in Photoshop. If I select the first image in the sequence, After Effects knows that it's an image sequence, and therefore this is automatically ticked, but it's worth checking that it is ticked before you hit open. You don't need to select all of them, just the first one in the sequence is fine, and it will just automatically import the rest of them. Hit open, okay, and notice here it's imported it as a little stack rather than a whole long list of images here. Now, our first job is to tell After Effects how we would like it to treat that image sequence. So I'm going to go down here and hit Interpret Footage. And I'm going to set my frame rate for starters. I'm going to set my frame rate to 12.5. Our composition frame rate is at 25 frames per second. So if I set my image sequence frame rate to 12.5, it means for every image will have a duration of 2 frames. And for this sort of texture, I think that's plenty. If I set that to 25, it would be a bit fast and flickery and maybe a bit much. Notice down at the bottom here, it asks if you want to loop it. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to loop it 50 times. You can always go back and change that later. So you can always just select it in your project pane here and go back into that if you want to change it later on. Okay, so let's drag that down to the composition. And let me just scale that to size. Not best practice, but there we go. Should be bigger, ideally. So that's our first little texture, a little boil there. Now I'm going to show you how you can use this with other graphics, with some text, and I'm going to actually show you this with an Illustrator file. So, because I know you've been doing some Illustrator already. So if I go into my project pane, I can double click on that, or I can hit Command I to import, and I'm going to go back to here, and I'm going to select this. It's a Illustrator file, an AI file, and I'm going to import it as a composition. And you'll see why in a minute. So this is our composition, and inside the composition I have 4 separate layers. Now those are the layers that I set up in Illustrator before I brought it in. It's worth mentioning that actually if you go back and you create more layers in Illustrator, they won't automatically appear here. This will only show these layers, but I could go back into Illustrator and change these layers and save it, and it will automatically update here. But if I need to import another layer for this image, I'd need to import that separately and plop it in myself. So what have I got here? I've got two images and some text, some outline text. Okay, so I'm going to take this first figure here and I'm going to drag him down because I want to treat these all as separate elements so that I can use some of these nice textures that we created inside some of these images. So what I'm going to do is my Illustrator file is sitting on top of my image sequence here, and I'm just going to turn that off so I can show you what I did there. With the Illustrator file sitting on top of the texture, I then go down here to where it says track mat. Now if you can't see that, it might be because you need to toggle your switches and modes. There's 2 different modes that you can go onto on here. The only reason this is so that it's not too cluttered all the time. So if you don't see the right thing here, just tap on this little box down here and it will make this come up. So I'm going to go down here to track mat, and I'm going to alpha mat man 1, which is the Illustrator layer that I've just dragged down onto my timeline. And when I do that, it look here, it's turned off the visibility of man 1. Look, I can toggle that back on, off and on. But with the visibility off, all it's doing is it's using that shape information as an alpha mat. So understanding it as basically it's all about transparency and the solid shape. So it's using the solid shape and understanding the transparency around it and applying that to that figure. So we've got that silhouette now, and inside that silhouette we've got that texture. Okay, so now I'm going to take down my second man, move him over a bit. I think he's going to go there. It's in the foreground a bit. This is a Paul Rand inspired design, I think. Okay, and I can leave him like that. I can leave him a sort of solid colour if I wanted to, or I could perhaps bring in another texture into there if I wanted to. So let's find another texture. Let's go for scribble. So I've got another sequence here. This is a Photoshop sequence that I made, and it's got a bit of transparency in there. So all we've got here is these scribbly lines. It's an image that I made straight in Photoshop. And again, it's a sort of boiling sequence. And with the first one selected, Photoshop sequence ticked, I'm going to hit open. And I'm going to import it as footage this time, because I don't want it as separate layers. I just want it as one file. Okay, so that's scribble. I'm going to take it down and I'm going to sit it so it's just underneath our man. Now look what I haven't done. I haven't set the frame rate and I haven't told it to loop. So I can do that now. I can go to scribble in my project pane and I can click here on my interpret footage window. Again, I'm going to hit 12.5 so it doesn't go too crazy. And go back into there, and I'm going to make it loop 50 times again. Okay, once I've done that, can you see it allows me to stretch it out and make it last a lot longer. So that's our second texture. Now I'm going to apply that texture to our second man. So here, go to Alpha Matte, and there we go. We've got this. Ooh, this is quite moody now. Okay, so we've got this texture and this sort of scribbly texture in the foreground. So I'm going to make a background for this. You probably wouldn't want this much going on one file, but I'm sort of making a point about working with image sequences and how flexible it is. So if I go to bumpy paper, there we go, it's a bit more of a subtle one. So I'm going to choose my bumpy paper, Photoshop sequence. Okay, I'm going to import that as footage again. So there we go. Again, we need to change our frame rate for that in our interpret footage and say whether we want it to be looped. Okay, and I'm going to stick that right down underneath at the bottom. Ooh, again, it's a bit small. Probably should go for something slightly bigger than that. Okay, so there we've got, that's a bit much. We've got 3 different textures boiling and bubbling in 3 different ways. I can now take my text, which I think will sit nicely over the top of that image, and sequence. There we go. Just take that down to the beginning. Just to be fancy, I'm going to put a little bit of animation on that. So sequence, I'm going to put a position keyframe on. I'll cover this in a different workshop, but it's just showing you what you can do. Let's pop you over there. And image position keyframe. Yeah. Oops. Okay, so play now. There we go. So image sequences in After Effects. When you're finished, make sure you render it out using the correct settings. I'm just going to quickly run through that. So I'm going to export make sure I've got the composition selected, export, and I'm going to export using Media Encoder, I think. In Media Encoder, think about your output, think about whether you're taking it straight into YouTube, putting it straight onto the web, or whether you're going to Premiere with it, and think about the size and the aspect ratio of your image. Okay.